Buenos Aires, Buenos Aires, Buenos Aires, Buenos Aires, Buenos Aires, Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires, Buenos Aires.
Welcome, everybody. Please take a seat. We're going to start in about 1 minute. And I would suggest because of the style of seating, if there's an empty seat in the middle of your aisle, please move toward the center. That'll allow people that are coming shortly to have a seat on the edge. I know everyone likes to sit on the edge, I do, but please move to the center so everyone has room to sit down. Well, so before I lose your attention, let's get started. I know there'll be people coming in later simply because of the weather, but we do have a full day, so I'd like to get us going. My name is Eric Nee. I'm the managing editor of Stanford Social Innovation Review and co-sponsor of this conference, and I'd like to welcome you to the Data on Purpose Do Good Data Conference. Also like to welcome those of you from elsewhere to sunny California. Hopefully the weather will clear up a bit later today so we can enjoy some of the outdoor spaces in this area. Stanford Social Innovation Review is the leading media organization dedicated to bringing forth new ideas and practices in the field of social innovation. We publish the magazine, which I hope you all got in your handouts, called appropriately Stanford Social Innovation Review. We also publish hundreds of original articles online, produce podcasts and webinars, and host conferences such as this one. We're co-sponsors of today's conference along with our sister organization, the Digital Civil Society Lab. I say sister organization because both of us are part of the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, also referred to as PACS, an interdisciplinary research center here at Stanford for students, scholars, and practitioners to explore and share ideas about social change. This year's event is the result of a merger between Data on Purpose, a conference that Stanford Social Innovation Review hosted the last few years here, and Do Good Data, a conference hosted by Andrew Means in Chicago. These two conferences were in many ways complementary, so we decided to join forces and create one super conference. And we do think it is a super conference. We have a terrific lineup of speakers for you these next 2 days. And just as important, we have all of you, more than 400 people from across the country and literally around the world. We have people from Montreal, London, Berlin, Vienna, Warsaw, Sofia, Mumbai, Seoul, Sydney, to mention just a few. So please take the time to talk to the other people in the room. You'll probably learn as much at lunch and in the hallways, talking with your fellow attendees, as you will here in the auditorium. Before we get started, I want to take just a couple of minutes to thank our sponsors, without whom we could not bring you this conference. They are Microsoft, MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, Flux, Teradata, Splunk, Valparaiso University, Data Arts, and DataKind. You can find these sponsors listed in your program along with more information about each of them. Now I want to introduce our two co-hosts for the conference, Andrew Means and Lucy Bernholtz. We're really lucky to have these two as our guides these next 2 days, because Andrew and Lucy are two of the leading thinkers, doers, and advocates of using digital data safely, ethically, and effectively to make our world a better place. As I already mentioned, Andrew is the founder and host of the Do Good Data Conference, which is now merged into this. He's also the head of Beyond.Uptake, the philanthropic and civic innovation arm of Uptake, a Chicago-based software company that does predictive analysis for large corporations. Lucy Bernholtz is a senior research scholar at PACS and director of the Digital Civil Society Lab, whose aim is to create new mechanisms for using, governing, and donating digital assets for public benefit. Among other things, Lucy is also a prolific author. She co-edited the book Philanthropy in Democratic Societies, published last year by the University of Chicago Press, and is the author of the annual Blueprint series on philanthropy and the social economy, which you can find out in the lobby on one of the tables. So please join me in welcoming Lucy and Andrew.
Good morning, everybody. I learned a new term this morning. It's called an atmospheric river, and we're in the middle of it. So I want to thank Eric and acknowledge as well the delightful California weather we're having. I'm Lucy Bernholtz. As Eric said, I am the director of the Digital Civil Society Lab.
My name's Andrew. I am the head of the Uptake Foundation, Beyond Uptake, co-founder at the Impact Lab, and the founder of the Do Good Data Conference. And I'm so excited to do this hybrid partner event with Stanford and their Data on Purpose conference.
But you know, Andrew, it's really not just the Do Good Data Conference and the Data on Purpose conference.
Lucy, you're really not very good at math. This is a data conference. We should at least get arithmetic correctly.
All right, bear with me, bear with me. I am a historian by training, but this is my math, and I'm gonna make this point through the next 2 days. We're here today, all of you and Andrew and I, to make as much as we possibly can of the moment we're living in. These are extraordinary times, and the opportunities to use digital data and infrastructure for good sit before every one of us. But we really need to think about how we do that in a way that preserves the values of civil society. And the conference itself is more than just the sum of one and one, because we're here at Stanford. We are standing on the shoulders of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, as Eric mentioned, which is really our host for the entire event. What that brings to us are the resources not only of this university, but of scholars around the world. There are several faculty members who will be speaking from the stage here and in some of the breakout sessions. There are several faculty members from law, politics, economics, computer science, mathematics, mechanical engineering, joining us throughout the 2 days in the audience and as participants, and I encourage you to meet with them. We're also standing on and folding into my strange arithmetic the work that the lab has been doing since we launched 3 years ago in this room with a conference on the ethics of data. And that was a global conference about the intersection and the growing dependence of not-for-profit organizations, individual political activists, informal associations, foundations, individual donors, income investors, political activists, our growing dependence on digital data and infrastructure and what that means for how we organize as people in democracies. So we stand on that work, and we'll be presenting some of what we've been building with you and for you later in this hour. And we also are the result of a decade-long community building effort called Markets for Good. Many of you have participated in previous conversations hosted by Markets for Good. You may be familiar with the website and the blog. We will be introducing some of the extraordinary new partners that community has been bringing together later in this session. But there's really, it may look like 1 + 1, Andrew, but trust me, it adds up to at least 3. So that's where we come from. That's the setting we're in. But tell us a little bit about your work and the Do Good Data Conference and the moment we're in.
Yeah, I think this idea of the moment that we're in is really important. And there's been work that's been happening for a long time to get us here. And to understand that, I want to take a minute and talk about 2 motivations that have made this possible. One, a personal motivation of myself that I think many of us in this room share, and then the technological motivations that have brought us to this moment. So the first one is this. It's the summer of 1999. I spent it halfway between Johannesburg and Durban, South Africa, teaching English in rural Zulu schools. Now, teaching is a bit of a stretch, because I was 14, and I was barely older than anyone there, and I had a weird haircut. But it was a summer that I spent where the vast inequalities and injustices of the world were made real. I think it's a moment that many of us have. I think for many of us in the room who have chosen to go into this work, into this field, we've had a moment where the injustices, the inequalities, the things that are broken about the world were made real. And this was the moment for me. In 1999, South Africa was being ravaged by the AIDS crisis. And I remember going into huts and villages and seeing families that were being decimated by this disease. I saw kids who were starving, who had lost parents to HIV and AIDS. I'd seen kids that were suffering of the disease. And for a 14-year-old from suburban Connecticut with a hedge fund manager dad and a stay-at-home mom, it was about the furthest thing from my lived experience. And I go back to this moment again and again because it set me on this trajectory to say there are things about the world that I want to see changed, and I want to be a part of changing them. And for me, that journey actually took me to data. For a lot of my colleagues in the kind of data for good community, other data scientists, they began as data scientists, as engineers, as mathematicians, statisticians. I began as a youth worker on the south and west side of Chicago working with middle and high school kids. And what I realized was that data provided the opportunity to help me do my job better. Data provided the opportunity for me to understand what worked and what didn't, and to amplify what worked and to innovate when things didn't. So that's how I ended up in data. And I think many of us share this kind of moment where we have this personal motivation that there's something about the world as it is today that we want to see different for tomorrow, and that we feel, that we see this opportunity that data can provide to help us achieve that, and achieve it in new and innovative ways. So outside that personal motivation, there's a few things, technologically speaking, that have made today, the era that we live in, possible. The first is this. How many of you have a smartphone? iPhone, Pixel, et cetera. So there's more computational power on this phone than there was on the space shuttle. Like the thing I play Angry Birds with is more powerful than the thing that took people into outer space. Which is scary for two reasons. One of them being that thing took people into outer space and it had like no computing power. And so it's quite amazing. So what we're seeing, though, is this a vast increase in computational power. And really, there's innovations on the horizon that I think will continue to just exponentially increase the amount of computational power that's accessible to us. The things that we can do on our laptops that we buy at Best Buy are more powerful than supercomputers were just a couple decades ago. The second thing is this, decreasing data storage costs. Storage is something that's ubiquitous, that we almost give away for free. You sign up for Gmail, you get free storage. You sign up for Dropbox, you get free storage. It just is, it's so cheap that we almost give things away for free. And because of that, we're starting to store more and more data. This is, I've done some work with Boeing, and one of the things that I've learned is that on a transcontinental flight, so New York to LA, let's say, they're creating terabytes of data. They're creating terabytes of data off of all of the sensors and the mechanics and the electronics that are on an airplane. And this is leading to us collecting data that we didn't even think about collecting before. We're starting to attach devices to ourselves to monitor how much activity we have, to learn more about ourselves. And this is, I think, a really interesting revolution that's going on right now. If you think of the first digital revolution in the 90s, early 2000s, what it was taking transactions that occurred in the real world, letters and shopping, things like that, and moving it into a digital world. And so the entire transaction moved from physical to digital. What we're seeing now with sensors and things like Fitbit and all of that stuff is we're going back into the physical world and saying, I can capture data about this activity. And the activity doesn't need to change. All you need to do is bring your phone. So these three things, increasing computational power, decreasing storage costs, and an increasing censored life, have led to technological revolutions, have really led to a new world that we're living in. And as we look ahead at the not-so-distant future and the kind of current reality, we see a few things. We're seeing autonomous vehicles. We're seeing cars that can drive themselves. We're not quite to the Jetsons, but we're getting there. We're seeing, and this is not, like, again, this is not something that we're talking about being decades away. There are autonomous vehicles on the road right now picking people up and driving around. Like, you can be in Pittsburgh, and you call an Uber, and there's no driver. Like, today. That's crazy. We're seeing medicine change. The company that I work at, Uptake, one of the co-founders has another company that just uses data about patients to focus cancer medications and determine what kind of cancer medication fits your specific biology, your specific system, and things like that. So it's changing the way that we perform medicine. We're seeing it change things in the social sector as well. There's work being done on human trafficking and anti-poaching and using data coming off of airplane manifests, a project I'm working on, pulling data coming off of border monitoring posts to better understand who's being victimized and how, and can we prevent it in new and innovative ways. We're seeing organizations be able to better keep track of their donors and their constituents and the people that they serve in easy cloud-based systems. We're seeing organizations better understand programmatic information about those that they serve, whether it be through events or programs, students that you're working with in your after-school program. More and more data is being generated about people, and more data is being used to improve our programs and operate them in efficient and effective manners. We're seeing organizations take open data and use it to spur on conservation efforts. I've heard about groups that are using both overlaying geospatial data with license data and business type data to understand who's at risk of polluting rivers and things like that. And there's vast amounts of open information that are making this possible. But yet, there's also some challenges to these things.
And one of the interesting things about this world we live in is the connection between us as individuals and the systems that are being built around us and that we're contributing to. For each of the examples that Andrew just gave, there are hard questions to be asked about how these new technologically driven, data-driven innovations are going to affect us in our daily lives. So in addition to having autonomous vehicles, I think it's fair to say, if there are any political philosophers in the room, no one has made the trolley problem more relevant to more people than the fact that we have these cars on the road. And the trolley problem is the classic philosophical question of, who do you kill? How do you program the cars to make the right decisions in the case of an impending crash? Because it's not just a matter of teaching the car to go left. It's a matter of making decisions as a society about how it is we want those cars to choose when to go left. It's also a question of recognizing that some of the very same computational methods and the same extraordinary sizes of data that allow us to create breakthroughs in precision medicine are also being used and being applied in places in which the application of algorithmic superpowers and massive data sets allows us to incarcerate people of color at greater rates faster. That's not really the outcome we were looking for. So we have to think about the context in which we're applying these capacities. We also, the very same phenomenon that allows us to capture some of the data and help intervene in situations of human trafficking to help keep vulnerable people safe it's the same data that every person in this room is generating by the virtue of either the device on your wrist or the phone in your pocket, that in fact may be making each of us more vulnerable than we had ever realized. Because recognizing and understanding what data we're now generating, where it's going, and who has access to it is a core question for us as people and as nonprofits. Cloud storage, it's fantastic to be able to access all of the records of our programs, whether I'm at my desktop computer here at Stanford or looking on my tablet while I'm traveling, and know that my colleagues have access to that information as well, and that we can update it together and in real time. Until I start to wonder, well, wait a second. Whose servers is that information actually sitting on? And how will I know if, in fact, the FBI, immigration services, or one of the other departments of my own government or of other countries' governments is subpoenaing that information, has asked for that information to be taken down. And for so many of us, the work we do and the people we serve, our goal is to help them, not to make them more vulnerable. And so in using these systems, we are in fact folding those players into our work in ways that we need to invent to understand how to manage those relationships and how to govern them. This is also very true with our ability to keep track of all of you here in this room. It's possible there's somebody in this room who'd rather not have it be known that he or she is in this room. And by being able to report better information to our funders, to keep track of how many young people, how many old people, people of color, women, gays, whoever it is, who might be attending and working with us, the bigger question to ask is, are we beginning to impinge on our right to peaceful assembly, a right granted in the UN Declaration of Human Rights for everyone on this planet? That we have the right, the human right, to come together privately and peacefully. Sometimes to come to a conference and hear Andrew and Lucy make jokes about math, and sometimes to do other things. But when it's all being captured digitally, we have to think very hard about what it is we're keeping track of, and where we're keeping track of it, and what the rules are for how we're using that information. There's also an extraordinary moment we're facing right now, for the first time, I think, in the US, but this has happened in other places, and the US stands by waiting to learn from those of you who are in the room who've experienced this. We have nonprofit organizations. We have whole sectors of civil society now that are making extraordinary use of open government data. They're doing incredible things, except when they can't get the data anymore, except when a government says no more and shuts it down. I think there's some folks here from Canada who've experienced this in the climate world for the last decade or so. This is certainly an issue here in the US. There are whole sectors in climate and in healthcare where people who have built entire programs and services and sectors using openly available government data are now worried about how they're going to function going forward. And the very same processes that make that data open and available to them in the first place have also made it possible for their friends in other countries to just start archiving it for us. So there's a positive side and a flip side, and we need to turn these things over and over to make sense of what's going on here. We in this room who care about civil society have an opportunity to set new global standards for what this looks like. But we have to first recognize that we stand together in doing this. That whether or not you're here from an arts organization in Canada, an environmental organization in Seoul, a data collecting nonprofit infrastructure organization in Mumbai, we are all in something called civil society, and we have responsibilities that distinguish us. First and foremost, and outside of the US, the phrase that's usually used is non-governmental organizations. First and foremost, we do not have the power of compulsion that our governments have. We do not have that obligatory relationship to the people we work with. They work with us voluntarily. We participate by choice. That is an extraordinary strength. Similarly, we don't exist to maximize profit. We don't need to jump on every new data whiz-bang innovation trend thing because we might be able to make money off of it someday. We don't need to store every type of data we might ever be able to think of because someday our staff will consist of 15 six-figure salary data scientists, 14 server racks, and the kind of people that only the companies on the other side of El Camino can hire. First of all, that ain't going to happen. We're not going to have those people. We're not going to have those skills, and maybe we don't need them because we're not trying to make a dollar off the data here. So when we start to think about the data differently as a resource for civil society, we have the opportunity to then say to ourselves, well, what are we here for? What do we do? Why is there a nonprofit sector? Why are there foundations? This is the answer to that question. This is the definition we use at the Digital Civil Society Lab. We are here because human beings like to do things that help other people. That's why we're here, every one of us. Your organizations are simply institutional manifestations of this desire to take what we have, whether that's time or money or data, and come together with other people and do something that benefits other folks. That's why we're here. And that definition is profoundly helpful when we then ask ourselves, okay, so what differentiates us? What can that definition give us in terms of a starting place to think about how to use our resources? Because that definition has given us all of the norms and all of the rules that you're very familiar with when it comes to using time or money. We know how to use time and money, right? We're good at that. We protect them, we respect them, we treat them with integrity. Now we need to figure out how to do it with data. We go back to the basic definition. From this definition, the lab, working in partnership with many people in this room and around the world, is building a resource where you'll be able to find all of this so that you can actually take these ideas and put them to action. But let me just spend a minute each on each of these 4 ideas, because these are core pillars, if you will, to understand the opportunities that we all have in front of us. Consent is first and foremost. You know how to work with volunteers, right? And you know that your donors come to you of their own choice. And even the people we work with often have many choices. Maybe not as many as they should, but often have many choices. We need to design our processes for using digital data infrastructure in ways that respect the agency and individuality of those folks. They need to be able to come in digital speak, that's called opting in. And as anyone here who's ever managed a volunteer knows all too well, they also need to be able to leave. Because it's not voluntary if you're closing the door behind them. Just ask my teenager, right? We need to think hard about consent. We need to think very hard about privacy. Again, we have experience here. In fact, we're global leaders on this. Most of you, if not every one of you, has at some point in your professional lives as a nonprofit or foundation thought hard about donor intent. You've thought about it in terms of the person giving you a check, however. I want you to think about it in terms of the people whose data you're using. It is a resource. It is a digital instantiation, as Andrew was showing with the watch, of a person. Respect it, recognize it as theirs, and do everything you can to protect it. For many of us in this room, doing what we can to protect that data actually requires us to do exactly the opposite of what every advertisement you've seen for the last decade about data has told you to do. Every advertisement you've seen has told you more, more, more. And I'm here to say, maybe not so much. Maybe we need less, because the best way to protect something is to not collect it in the first place. We're here to invent that set of practices. We also have to go back to the very beginning, that core definition. We exist to serve a public purpose, and we know that that purpose will be better served if we can find allies and share what we know. So if we know that we're here to do something for others, we know that we're going to be opening up something, maybe not our deepest data sets, because that's not safe, but something, our outcomes, our work, our strategies, then trust me, you will figure out a way to get permission for the data, and you will do everything you can to protect it. Otherwise, you can't open it. The fourth principle, and all of these, you'll have access to these to dig deeper over time, is the very strength of civil society in democracies. Civil society is where the majority isn't, right? Democratic systems, when they're working, work because the majority of opinions are making governing decisions. We are the home of the fragmented, contentious, diverse, divisive minorities. Let's hear it for us. That's what we're here for. This is our strength. And when we build our data tools, we need to build from that strength. We need to build with the people whose data we're using. We need to build a multitude of tools and use a multitude of opportunities, not become dependent on a single set of systems. We need to include the voices of those people in how we do our work. And we need to understand, particularly as we move more and more into a world in which large data sets are analyzed by algorithms, that all that is, folks, is another way of making decisions. And we want our decisions to be understood and credible. So we need to find ways to share how we're using those tools. Those 4 principles are the backbone of a community-driven website called digitalimpact.io that the lab has been building over the last couple of years, again, with many people in this room and many organizations around the world. I encourage you to check it out. It is aspirationally, our aspiration for this is a GitHub of governance, built by you, for you, to help you use digital data safely, ethically, and effectively. So I hope you'll join us in building this. Those principles guide us to some of the standards. This really is about recognizing that when we understand and work from our shared responsibilities, there's almost nothing but possibility out there. And we've already seen this. I mean, how many of you have ever gone to Wikipedia? Anybody who doesn't raise your hand may not be fully, that may be an alternative fact. Wikipedia is the 5th most visited website in the world. The first 4, no doubt, are commercial companies with huge marketing budgets. Wikipedia is a nonprofit. I believe there's fewer than 100 people who work there, and the content is provided by volunteers. We can do this. Creative Commons. How many here have ever licensed anything under a Creative Commons license? Or understood? That's almost everybody in the room. 1.5 billion licenses in use right now. 80 countries where this nonprofit-led licensing project about how individuals relate to their digital data, because that's what's at the heart of Creative Commons, changed the laws in dozens of countries around the world, changed how we think about intellectual property. We can do this. Consent. Now, here's a great one. Consent, oh, that's hard. We prefer to hide behind our 28-page, 9-point font terms of service agreement, and if you don't click agree, we're not going to let you use the website. That's the only way you can handle it. That is not the only way you can handle it, folks. If your business model doesn't incentivize consent, maybe that's the only way you want to handle it. But if you work for Sage Bionetworks and you're trying to get people to participate in medical research and understand what they're participating in, you have a very different set of values driving this. And the folks from Sage Bionetworks and some of their partners took on this question of consent and redesigned a consent process. And then they gave it away, and you can have it. It's free, it's openly licensed, it's for medical research that happens on your phone. We can do this. We talked about this a little bit, those of you who joined us last night to hear from Julia Angwin. ProPublica, a not-for-profit news organization which is busy reinventing the news business, not only builds data sets to drive its investigative journalism, it gives them away, and it maintains them. That itself is the public benefit that's at the core of ProPublica's work. We can do this. We have an extraordinary opportunity, each and every organization in this room, to recognize that by using digital data and infrastructure, what we have done Every time you use a spreadsheet, every time you use a cell phone, every time you put something online, every time you check somebody in to a meeting on your iPad, every time you do any of that, you have digitized your service provision. You have alloyed together two processes: the actual service you're providing, the product you're building, whatever it is you're doing, and your data collection systems. There were two things, now they're one. That gives us the opportunity to get two benefits from every action. But this truly is where my math skills fall short. Because this is not addition. This is calculus. With that alloying comes risk analysis, comes thinking about how to maximize the opportunity, thinking about how to minimize the risk. This truly isn't arithmetic. This is what we're inventing together.
And to take advantage of this, to really drive development from a values-based perspective, requires us to skill up in some new ways. I think it's why many of us are in this room today, is because there are things that we need to learn to do better, that we need to, skills we need to start attracting into our organizations and start using inside of our organizations. We need to find people that understand technology and understand data to help us wrestle with the tensions that we've been talking about. This isn't an either-or situation. This is about saying our organizations exist to help people. How do we best help them? And if sometimes that means saying you're an extremely vulnerable population and collecting individual information on you would make you more vulnerable, the answer is not collecting more information on them. But if sometimes it's going to be saying collecting some information from you will actually help us provide a better service to you, we're able to protect that data, we're able to keep it private and secure, and we're able to actually help increase the outcomes that you're able to achieve. So we need to know where these lines are. We need to understand how to navigate these questions. I like what Lucy said around algorithms being about decision making. It really is. We want to make good decisions in this sector. We want to make decisions that help people, that don't put people at risk, that deliver on the change that our organizations exist to create. And technology is a way to help us do that. But to get there, and to get there from a values-based perspective, requires us gaining new skills. It requires us really leveraging the diversity in our sector. It's about bringing data scientists together with the constituents whose data that they're working with. It's about bringing executive directors of social service agencies into the room with technologists and them actually listen to one another. This is not about a right answer or a wrong answer. This is about wrestling with the tensions that data is creating in our world, in our sector, and coming up with new guidelines, with wisdom, to make decisions that help us serve the people and the organizations we exist to serve. There's some exciting work being done deploying data and technology in the sector. I'm seeing organizations use things like satellite imagery to actually detect disease monitoring in agriculture, trying to help communities that are at risk of wheat rust, which just devastates food supply chains, and actually predict when that's going to happen, intervene earlier, and provide more stability around the global agricultural system. We're seeing organizations like Code for America going into government and saying, we want to help build you better technology to serve the citizens of your community. We're seeing groups like the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation monitor the SDGs in new ways, show the value of machine learning, data visualization, in tracking progress that communities and countries are making towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We're seeing organizations like Air Shepherd, who's here, that uses UAVs and drones to actually monitor poaching in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. They're actually, I was with this organization just a couple weeks ago in South Africa, and they are innovating technology in responsible ways, not out of a business desire, but out of a desire to solve a huge problem. It is possible for us to develop really great technology, to use data in really innovative ways, but in ways that align with our values. And I think the danger is that if we just kind of copy the commercial model, if we just follow in the steps of the Googles and the Facebooks and the LinkedIns and all of the technology companies of the world, we put ourselves at risk of developing in a way that's not always aligned to our values. We do have different incentives. We have different constraints that we operate under. We have different goals. And because of that, we should develop technology in some different ways. We should be creating new, innovative solutions that meet the goals that we have, meet the objectives that we have, but in a way that aligns with our values. We're seeing organizations begin to gather constituent voice in new and innovative ways. Slum Dwellers International, who's working throughout the world now, helping people in informal settlements amplify their voice so that they're as loud as the government and able to ask for the services that they need by using data and mapping their community in a very collaborative way. There's ways of doing this and doing it well. And this is why we have the Good Data Grants program. The idea was we want to identify people, organizations that are doing this kind of development, that are developing data and technology from a place that's values-driven, values-aligned. So, Lucy, I want to hand off to you to announce our winners.
Yeah, so we're very excited to be joined here today by the 7 projects that were selected by a group of reviewers assembled through the Markets for Good community and funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This is the first year of the Good Data Grants. There are 7 projects that were selected. I'm just going to read off the names of the lead organization in each project. Many of them are collaborations, but I want to ask the folks who are here from these projects, which are just launching, to stand up, because I hope you'll have a chance to meet with these folks and learn about the work they're doing. And we'll also be announcing another round of these grants. The RFP and the process will begin this spring. So I'm just going to read them all off. If you'd stand up, please, if you're here. The Alliance of Information and Referral Systems is working with open government data. The Media Mobilizing Project. The Nonprofit Data Basic I/O Toolkit. Stay standing. Come on, get up there. Data Labs and the folks at GovLabs who are innovating not just about data, but about organizational structure. Great Nonprofits, which is doing some work on donor motivation and the use of rapid surveys. Drexel University is doing an ecosystem mapping project. And the Good Data Collaborative is 4 organizations, including the Center for Democracy and Technology, the Future Privacy Forum, SimLab, and the Engine Room. So give these folks a hand. Get a good look at them. They'll be here for the 2 days. We are starting this as a cohort. We'll be adding folks to it over time. We're also trying to walk a little of our talk, so we're quite excited about the way we manage the process. This is actually an interactive data visualization you can access at this URL of 97% of the organizations that applied for the funding, not just those that won, but those that applied. We asked them in advance if we could share their contact info, their basic program information, so that all of us can get a sense of what kinds of things folks are working on and what they're trying to learn. And we'll be continuing to build this out, both with the Good Data Grants and actually possibly with some other grant-making efforts run by some foundations and others who are working to invest in these projects that are taking us closer to the question of what does it mean to be a digital civil society? What are the software opportunities we need? What are the organizational challenges we need? What are the legal frameworks we need? This is what we are co-creating. This is the heart of the work of the lab in trying to understand this. And we're quite clear, we're quite sure that for civil society to thrive globally in the digital age, we collectively, the grantee organizations and all of you here in your day-to-day work and in some of your bigger aspirational visions, need to create 3 new kinds of code: software code, organizational code, and legal code. And you'll notice, perhaps, and when you go back and look at your program for the next 2 days, I hope that you'll see that these themes are woven through each of the sessions. When I talk about software code, it's quite simple. If we start to build unused software with and for and by the very people we exist to help, we will open up opportunities for more donations, more volunteering, and more participation, because we will be the place where people know that their data are respected and treated with integrity. We will define ourselves by how we actually build those systems. If, or when, or maybe if, each of us begins to build our organizational data practices in line with this understanding of the responsibilities we have as a whole sector of society. The responsibilities we have to each other, the responsibilities we have to the people we serve. Just as we've already shown living examples of this happening, we will set the standards. Nonprofits and foundations and associations, we will set the global standards for the safe, ethical, and effective use of data. That's what we have the opportunity to do. And if, or only if, we think about the legal frames that guide our sector, most of which exist at the national level, but some of which are being built out transnationally. If we think about and advocate for legal regulations and policies that bring into the digital world where we all now live the same human values and rights of peaceable assembly, free expression, and privacy, if we do that, then civil society can thrive. Then democracies will be able to sustain themselves. That's the challenge we face. That's the opportunity we have, and that's why all of us are here. So I'm going to say it again, Andrew. I think it adds up to more than just two conferences as one. I think we have an extraordinary opportunity, and I say, let's do this.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much.
We're about 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
So we want to make sure, it's not just people up here talking to people at you out there. We want to have some Q&A. So if you have a couple questions, feel free to go to one of the microphones over there or over there, and Lucy and I will talk about anything, including how we were wrong. And if you disagree with us, that's totally fine. So feel free to go over to one of the mics, and we'll take a couple questions for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll dive into our next session. But let's give people another chance to grab those microphones. Anybody have a question? It's hard to see.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I have a question for you, Lucy. We can sit down. So Lucy, as you look forward and the three frameworks that you're talking about with the Digital Civil Society Lab of software, governance, was that the second? Organizational and legal. What do you see as some of the big challenges and opportunities for development in those three spheres as we look over, let's say even just over 2017? Like, what are you hoping to see happen over this year?
Well, one of the amazing things that has happened for those of us here in the US is a heightened sense of urgency, I'd say, for recognizing the distinctive role of civil society. And that's actually been, I think, for many of us, the biggest barrier. So many of us as people, and I include myself as one of those, we just adapted to the technologies that were provided to us. I'm an historian. I can't even add very well, right? I'm not out there coding things. So when you hand me a really sexy cell phone, I'm going to use it. And I'm going to be really thrilled by the fact that I can now, find my way to where I'm going using the map that's on the phone and text when I'm going to be late because, oops, I'm going to be late, right? I can do all that. So we've adapted to the world that has been given to us. Most of the people, I'm guessing this, but how many people in this room have ever written a line of software code? Okay, actually, so that's a good half the room. That's fantastic, right? Many of us haven't, and actually don't ever want to, right? So awareness is a big part of this, recognizing that our individual generation of our clicks and our tweets and our swiping in and out of the building and the photos, right? That's creating all this data, that's building this world around us. We have to carry a slightly different awareness of that into organizations, find new colleagues who can help us then think about, if this is our purpose, how do we create tools that reflect our values and our decision making, and then collectively we move forward.
Well, and I think that's, to that point though, I think to help us get there, we need to have some knowledge about how this new world works. Yeah. I was watching our best friend's 2-year-old all weekend, and she has this toy that's like supposed to help teach 2-year-olds how to code, basically. And it's like you put things together and it turns different directions based on how you order the things. And I find that stuff really interesting because I think we need to have a new literacy around data and technology, just to know.
Yeah.
We sign things all the time, so we have no idea how they work. I talk to people who are trying to use technology that feels like this black box that they have no idea what's inside, and I think that's the danger.
Right.
I think we will not develop the tools and technology we need if we don't know how to interact with them.
Right.
If we don't know how to use them, if we don't know when they're going to go wrong and break and make the wrong decision.
And one of the wonderful things about this sector, and everybody in this room, is whether or not you know how to write a piece of code, most of us have had the privilege of living in democratic systems. And it's those values that matter here. It's that the recognition that decision-making is a power relationship, that the decision-making process itself needs to be transparent in a way that just as I can go to my city council, I can go to my neighborhood group, I can actually go to the White House and express my opinion, I have that same right. We in this sector need software that we can understand at least in some similar way. We need to know, how are the decisions being made? Who's making them? What are you using to make those decisions? That doesn't involve an understanding of programming. It involves an understanding of democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Michael, do you have a question over there?
Yeah. Sorry, 2 questions. The first one is simple and maybe silly. So I'm with an organization called Powered by Data. We work on open data. And I'd love to be able to get the data from the visualization that you shared about the grants you're giving out.
Yep.
And I couldn't find a way to do that. So
Oh,
this is
well,
a
we need to fix
request.
that.
This is a request. And this is
Fixed.
great. So, because when you think about sharing data, obviously there's different types of users, people that want to use the data directly themselves and people that want to understand it. Second question, so we're thrilled that we're having you both come up to Toronto soon. I'm wondering, you're doing some great stuff about starting a learning community, obviously bringing together some projects here at Stanford, and then there's obviously other people that are contributing great stuff with GovLabs is a great example. And Canada, we're doing different things. I'm curious about what you imagine as the community that you want to have in 10 years. Obviously, it seems it's a global community. What does that look like in terms of the developing of expertise and sharing information? Because I'm trying to think of it myself, and I'm still not there yet.
Yeah, great question. I think I can identify now the kinds of communities that need to be part of that community, I think. We need the nonprofits themselves, those organizations. We need people. We need people who interact with nonprofits, what are often called constituents or beneficiaries, but we need people. We need donors. We need scholars who understand and are pushing the boundaries of both the technological frameworks, but also the legal and economic frameworks. A lot of that work happens in universities. A lot of it also happens in communities, and those 2 communities are not well connected, but we're working on it. And it's one of the real strengths of Stanford PACS is to bring together scholars and communities. And we need advocates. We need to recognize that civil society's policy agenda from now going forward, as far as I can see, is the digital policy agenda. As important as the tax code and the corporate code in most countries are 2 domains that we know very little about as a civil society sector, and that is digital policy and surveillance. Those are the frames in which we operate. And we need to join those conversations. So we're really excited to help kick off with this meeting. Those are the kinds of folks in this room I forgot technologists. They're in this room as well. They're here. The companies that are building these tools and others. We need to create this together. So those are the communities we're trying to weave. I also want to say we're very aware that, I thought the sun came out. It's not the sun, it's just that really bright light. I was so excited for a second. I was so excited to say, look, it's California. We're here in California. We are here in California. Sun's still not out. Don't look out there. Not everybody can come to Palo Alto. It's not enough to have this conversation here. It's not enough for more than just logistical reasons. It's not enough because the culture of civil society is different in different parts of the world. And the vision for digital civil society is global. The legal regimes now are national, but the internet and the connectivity is global. And I think that's going to change over the next 10 years.
And as I think about 10 years from now, I would agree it's about bringing these communities together. But for me, I didn't start Do Good Data. I don't do the work that I do because I want every organization to have data and to use a bunch of technology. I want to solve problems. My hope is that in 10 years, we get to a point where the conversation is about how do we use data and technology to solve the problems that we have, and actually having more tools that enable us to do that, and doing it from a values-based perspective. And so for me, the goal is not that every nonprofit uses data. The goal is that every nonprofit's really effective. I think to do that, they need to learn how to use data. And to get there, we need to bring these communities together. So thank you, everyone. Really glad to kick off the conference with Lucy. Welcome. Stay in your seats, because we have something very exciting coming up. But thank you guys so much for the first session. So I've been doing Do Good Data for about 4 years, and I wanted one speaker. There's one speaker that I've been trying to get a hold of and come. And his name's Hal Varian, and I'm excited that he's here today. I'm super pumped. So Hal Varian, if you're unfamiliar, was a brilliant academic, worked at some of the best universities around the world, actually published the textbook I used for my economics class. So I feel like I've gotten to know him from afar. I spent many hours reading intermediate microeconomics. But right now, he's the chief economist at Google, and I'm very excited to have him here to give us insights into big data and causal inference, which has a lot of applicability in our work and in our sector. So please give a warm welcome to Hal Varian. Thanks, Hal.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here in sunny California. And thank you very much for inviting me. So I will give you a little background here. About 2 years ago, there was a meeting at the National Academy of Science on causal inference meets big data. And we had social scientists, economists, political scientists, sociologists, statisticians, physicists, all sorts of different groups who talked about how causal inference and big data was used in their subject. And I was in charge of talking about how it's used in economics. So this talk actually, or earlier version of this talk, is available on the National Academy of Sciences website if you want to pursue that. And there's a paper that goes along with it as well. So the philosophy here was to make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. That's hard to do, so I'm just going to make it as simple as possible. And we'll see what happens. So the basic issue with doing causal inference, everybody hears this cliche almost that causality is not the same as correlation, but with causal inference, we're really trying to do something about that and trying to make causal inference without looking at just mere correlations. So here's a little problem, and it's from marketing. Maybe you're marketing a program, or you're trying to sign up donors, whatever. You might have the sales that you make in some city, and then you have the advertising that you've done, or the promotional work you've done in that city. And you might decide to fit a little model that says the donations I get depend on the expenditure I make in terms of developing the campaign. and I'm going to forget about a constant in that regression. I'm just going to make it as simple as possible. So there's an error. Usually your data doesn't fit or your model doesn't fit the data exactly. What you're interested in doing is getting a causal effect. If I changed my expenditure in one of these cities, what would happen to the donations? So what would happen if we sent 10% more in some particular city? So what are we going to do? How are we going to answer that? Well, the naive approach is we'll run a regression. We'll look at the sales in the cities, the advertising in the cities. We're looking at the donations in the city, and we'll try to see what the relationship is between those two variables. Now, when will you get a good estimate of that response? When will you find out that estimate you can really be confident about? Well, you want to have the X variable, the spend variable, independent of the error. The covariance between X and the error term is 0, because you don't want this kind of mixing up movements in the error term to movements in the X term. It seems it's easy to write down that assumption, but when you start thinking about it, you say, well, wait a minute, X wasn't just chosen randomly, or it wasn't assigned by a designer who was designing an experiment. It was chosen by people. It was chosen by people based on things they observe, and maybe some of the things they observe are in that error term, E, that I just wrote down. So there can be ways that changing things in the X affect the outcome in two different ways. They might change it by the choice that somebody made in choosing X, or they might change it through these variations in the factors that are in the error term. So really, you're very lucky if you have a client who's totally inept and just chooses things randomly, because then you've got a random experiment. But we rarely have such cases, particularly in social science. People are choosing this expenditure based on some rule or some principle or something they observe, and we have to take account of that when we try to estimate the impact of changing expenditure. So here's a little example. We have the two cities, one's Honolulu and one's Fargo, and we have a movie about surfing, and we're going to try to promote this movie in these different cities. So maybe in Fargo, they just spend a little bit of money, 10 cents a person, and they get a revenue of $1 out of that. And in Honolulu, maybe they spend quite a bit of money. They spend $1 per person, they get a revenue of $10. Well, this is fantastic. We fit the model perfectly. We fit the model perfectly, that the spend, the revenue that they get is just 10 times the spend. But here's the problem. Do you really think that increasing the expenditure in Fargo by a factor of 10 will increase the sales by a factor of 10? Not very likely. Not very likely. And why is that? Well, the revenue also depends on other factors like maybe interest in surfing. So the interest in surfing is pretty high in Honolulu, it's pretty low in Fargo, and that interest in surfing is going to affect the movie revenue directly, okay, but it's also going to affect it indirectly through the choice of how much the marketing board has decided to spend in Fargo. So in statistics, we call that a confounding variable. The interest in surfing is a confounding variable because it's affecting the outcome through these two different paths. We're really only interested in one of those paths, so how do we disentangle the effect and get a true causal estimate? So it's very, very common in any social science. Anytime you have a variable on the right-hand side that's chosen by somebody, you should start to worry about how that choice is made and how you can really get a causal estimate from that situation. In true experiments, if you really do an experiment, the predictors are independent of the error term. They're either randomized or they're chosen in a systematic way, and so everything works out great. True experiments are wonderful. But in the observational social science, when you can't do an experiment, maybe you can't do it because it's costly, maybe you can't do it because it's impracticable, the predictors are usually correlated with each other. And everybody knows that including a new predictor in a regression is usually going to change the coefficients of the other predictors, but then we blindly assume that that's not true for those predictors that are stuck off there in the error term that we don't get to observe. We don't observe them, but whoever made the choice is observing them, and that's where the problem lies. So if we had all the important predictors, if we had a model that fit perfectly, would feel good about that, but that never happened, so we don't have to worry about that particular observation. So now we get down to the crux of the matter, the difference between prediction and causal inference. If you have more observations that have the same data generating process, that is, however the expenditure was chosen in Fargo and Honolulu, you have the same choice rule being made in other places. If your goal is predicting revenue in other cities, then a regression is just fine. I mean, there's no problem because you're trying to get the best relationship between X and Y, and if you're using the same data generating process, you can do prediction, no problem. But if you try to predict what would happen if spend increased by some amount across the board, you would have a problem because you've changed the data generating process. It's now a different process, not chosen the same way. So you generally ask what would happen if the data generating process changes. You want to know if I intervene and do something different, what's going to happen? That's a causal question, right? It's not just looking at correlation. So here's a few examples from economics. How does fertilizer affect crop yields? Well, the assignment of fertilizer to plots of land would depend on the farmer's knowledge about where the fertilizer is going to do the most good. They choose the fertilizer application based on land quality and other things. So that choice depends on things the analyst doesn't observe, but the farmer does. How does education affect income? Well, students who have wealthy parents or high ability tend to acquire both more education and they have more income. They might have done just as well without that education. It's because they already have the ability. So here's ability that's a confounding variable in that model. Or how does healthcare affect income? Well, there you have potential for reverse causality. Those who have good jobs tend to have good healthcare, so you see higher healthcare associated with higher income. And there's issues about which way the causality really runs in that case. Now, we want to estimate, when we do policy, we want to ask what would happen if we applied more fertilizer in places? What would happen if we offered more scholarships? What would happen if we offered cheaper health insurance? All these different things are changing the data generating process, and using the observational data is not necessarily going to help in answering these questions. Ideally, you'd run an experiment, but in many cases, the experiment is just completely impractical. Now, one important consideration you should think about from the very beginning is how your policy relates to the experiment. Because in some policies, the treatment, whatever it is you're thinking about doing, is going to be imposed on the population. Everybody will have access to that treatment. Necessarily, it's imposed. In other cases, the treatment will be offered to the population and they get to choose whether or not they accept that treatment. So the first case is the impact of the treatment, the second case is the impact of the treatment on the treated, that is the impact of the treatment on those who choose to be treated, whereas the first case is the impact of the treatment on the population, where everybody gets it. And in an experiment, this is very tricky because often it's hard to impose a treatment on somebody. Typically, they have to agree to it, so you aren't necessarily getting the full answer to the question that you're originally asking. Okay, well, here's the fundamental identity of causal inference. The outcome for the treated, those who have the treatment, minus the outcome for the untreated, that can be written as the sum of those two terms, the outcome for the treated minus the outcome for the treated if they had not been treated. That's a counterfactual. That's you don't observe that. Plus the outcome for the treated if they're not treated minus the outcome for the untreated. So that measures how the treated are different than the untreated. Like people who go to college and people who don't go to college differ in many other dimensions. And you can write that as the impact of the treatment on the treated. That's the first thing. It's what you observed minus what you would have observed if you hadn't assigned the treatment. And the second part is the outcome for the treated if they hadn't been treated minus the outcome for the untreated. That is how the people who are treated differ from those who are untreated. So that's the impact of the treatment on the treated plus the selection bias. That's a very nice way to think about it when you're trying to understand this. Of course, the outcome for the treated minus the outcome for the untreated, that's what you observe. But what you're really interested in is typically the first first term there, the outcome of the treatment on the treated. Now, if the treatment's randomly assigned, that's super. That's really great, because then the selection bias is 0. The people who are treated are just like the people who are untreated on average, because it's a random assignment. And then the treatment impact of the treatment on the treated is the same as the impact of the treatment on the population. So that's the ideal case. And there's this wonderful book by Angris and Pischke, Mostly Harmless Econometrics, that goes into this in great detail. So I recommend that to you for future reading. Okay, so all that's theory. That's showing the problem, and now we want to get into what the solutions look like. What are the methods that social scientists can use to try to estimate causal inference from observational data? And the first thing you have to understand is, in general, you can't do it. I mean, like, you have to do an experiment. If you want to measure the impact of what happens when something changes, you actually have to change it and see what that impact is. Now, maybe you can do it on a small scale, which is an experiment, but typically you won't be able to do this for every possible problem, but there's some special cases that I'm going to describe where you can make some progress of estimating causal effects from observational data. And the first one is just randomized experiments, the classic. You might want to treat people at different times, so you've got a before, after on the same individuals. You might want to have a control group and a treatment group, and treat one group differently than the other group. The basic idea with either of these approaches is to use pre-experiment behavior to build a predictive model for the outcome. Because remember, what you want to ask when you're trying to get to the causal effect of a treatment, you say, well, what happened when I applied the treatment? And what would have happened, that's the counterfactual, what would have happened if I hadn't applied the treatment? Because that's the causal impact, and that's what you're really interested in. I award a fellowship to somebody, they go to college. Well, would they have gone to college anyway? We don't know. That's what you're trying to estimate, a model of what the counterfactual would be. So you use the pre-experiment behavior to build a predictive model, then you use that to estimate the counterfactual, and then you look at the difference between the actual outcome and what would have happened, or what you estimate would have happened. So I think of this as a 4-step process. You train a model, you test the model, you apply the treatment, and then you compare the treated to the counterfactual of what would have happened if they hadn't been treated. Here's a little diagram of that. This is actually real data. We trained the model in that left-hand box where we had a time series. In this case, it's visitors to a website. We test the model on this holdout, see how well it predicts in the future. We think we've got a pretty good model. Now we apply the treatment, and the black line is what we actually observed. The red line is what we forecast we would have observed without the treatment. And then we look at the differences being the causal effect of the treatment. And then we turn the experiment off, and sure enough, the actual goes back to our estimate of the counterfactual, which is what we like, and we've got an estimate of the effect. Now that's great if you have an experiment, but what happens if you don't have an experiment? So sometimes you can find a natural experiment, something that assigns treatment to some subjects or some subjects in a way that's as good as random, okay? So I'm going to use a kind of cute example, a very topical example, the Super Bowl. Now somebody asked how many people coded here. How many people saw the Super Bowl here? Yeah, well, it's about the same number, yeah, so good. So it was a good game. Well, it's well known in the Super Bowl, the home cities get elevated viewership. About 10 to 15% more people, population adjusted, watch the Super Bowl in the home cities of the teams that are playing. And that's true for every sport, right? You see that in baseball and hockey and all sorts of different sports, but it's quite obvious in the Super Bowl. Also, it's well known that the ads in the Super Bowl are sold out often as early as October or November. So the ad spaces in the Super Bowl were sold out before it's known who's going to be playing. So now think about it from the viewpoint of the advertiser. The advertiser lays down this money for an ad slot, And then 2 or 3 months later, 2 cities are chosen at random, right? As far as the advertiser is concerned, they're chosen at random, and they get 10% more viewership in those cities than in other cities. So there's 10% more ad exposures in those cities than in other cities. So it's almost as good, essentially as good as a randomized experiment. So what we did in our little study on this is we looked at movies, because movies are advertised during the Super Bowl. We looked at the attendance in movies. We looked at the difference between what happened in the cities where the home teams, the cities associated with the home teams of the cities associated that are the home cities of the teams that are playing. And sure enough, we saw quite a significant elevation in viewership as compared to the other cities. So it's kind of a nice example of a natural experiment. And instrumental variables, which economists use all the time, are a kind of a systematic way to think about natural experiments. So we have a model, we're worried about confounders, we're worried that X is contaminated by other things that are in the error term, and can we find something that moves X around that is independent of the error term? And in this particular case, the example is whether it's the home city of the teams that are playing. And then there's statistical techniques that you can use to estimate instrumental variable estimator that gives you, ideally, the true causal effect of changing X, getting rid of that contamination with the error term. So you might want to look at other problems in economics. You want to estimate how air travel revenue responds to change in ticket price. But the prices are chosen by the airlines. So they're chosen because of factors that the analysts might not be able to observe, but the airlines can certainly observe. So maybe when times are good and the economy is booming, airlines set a high price. And when the times are bad and it's kind of a slump, then they set a low price. And of course, people don't travel very much when times aren't good, and when times are good, they travel a lot. So what happens is now you've got this confounding variable, this times are good issue, because in your data, you'll see low prices are associated with low travel, and high prices are associated with high travel, and the demand curve goes the wrong way, right? That's not the way it's supposed to be. You're trying to look at the relationship between the travel and the price, holding other things equal, but they aren't equal, right? They aren't equal because the airlines have chosen the price based on these other factors that you may or may not observe. So it's a confounding variable, and what you want to do is you want to find something that impacts the price that's not associated with the general economic state, like maybe tax, the fuel costs, unionization, all sorts of other factors that could move that price around, but aren't associated with the macroeconomy in a significant way. Another question, another approach, or another model, statistical technique you can use to estimate these causal impacts is what's called a regression discontinuity design. So there's a classic question in education. What's the impact of class size on student performance? And you could look at student performances in big classes and students' performances in small classes, but it isn't, typically they aren't randomly assigned to big or small classes. Maybe in wealthy areas, they have small classes and they have students who have a lot of advantages. In poor areas, they don't, so there's going to be confounding going on there. So the solution that Josh Angrist and his colleagues came up with is they looked at a rule that was used in Israel that whenever a class had more than 40 students, they had to divide it in half. Okay, they had to make smaller classes out of it. But if it just had exactly 40 students, they didn't have to do that. So you saw classes that had 40 students, but if 41 students or 42 students, 46 students showed up on the first day, they created a new class and divided the students. That's wonderful because it's almost a random experiment, right? Those places that had 41 students show up the first day, they're not so different than the places where 40 students showed up. So it's almost like one of them can be thought of as a control group for the experiment of dividing the classes in half. And sure enough, he found a reasonably significant effect from having these smaller classes. People learn better. What's the impact of ISP speed on housing values? Nice paper done where they looked at houses where along the boundary of the ISP areas, houses on one side of the street were very similar to houses on the other side of the street or a block away. And so you had very similar cases, and you could look at the different speed by just comparing nearby houses in one ISP to houses in another ISP. And finally, the last example here is the impact of minimal legal drinking age on mortality. And what you want to do there is compare 20-year-olds to 22-year-olds, or in this case, it was 6-month data, 20-and-a-half-year-olds to 21-and-a-half-year-olds that were very similar in almost every other respect, but of course, one could drink and the other didn't. And the outcome is really striking. These are causes of death and age. And if you look at that line on the top, you see this big jump at age 21, which I think is quite plausible to attribute to the drinking becoming available at that age. And in fact, any one of you could probably say, well, what would the causal impact be? What would the outcome be of moving the drinking age to 22 or to 20 or to 19? Because you see the size of that gap, you see the slope of the line, and it would be pretty easy to make a good estimate of what that impact would be of that particular policy change. And you're getting there by using this regression discontinuity estimation. Another one that's interesting, I don't have a slide for it, but one of the early applications of this was looking at the impact of fellowships or student aid. You could look at what happened when student aid was awarded based on test scores, and you look at people who have just a little bit higher than the breakout point and people who have just scores that are a little bit lower, and you want to compare those two groups of people because it's pretty random which side of that border you fall on. So it's a nice way to look at impacts of various kinds of educational programs. And there was a very interesting case that Amy Finkelstein has been looking at in Oregon, where they ran out of Medicaid funds. They held a lottery for who got Medicaid. 1/3 of the applicants got Medicaid, and the other 2/3 didn't. She went back a few years later and looked at the health outcomes for the two people, because here you had a true randomized experiment that you never could have done on purpose, but they were able to do because they used a lottery out of desperation. They ran out of money, and so they had to have some way to assign people to the Medicaid. All right, last method is difference in differences. This is a very classic method that you see all the time. You look at something like sales. Again, I'll go back to the example I started with. Sales after the treatment for the treated group. So STA is after treated, and STB is sales before treated for the treated group, before the treatment's applied for the treated groups. And then SCA is a control group who didn't have the treatment applied. That's after and before as well. And so what you do is we want a little model of the counterfactual, what would have happened if the treatment wasn't applied. So we look at what happened to the control group, because they didn't have the treatment applied. So we see the difference there is the SCA, the after minus the before for the control group. We compare that to the after and before for the treated group, and then we say, well, what would have happened to the treated group is what did happen to the control group. That's our hypothetical. And then we can get an estimate of the true effect, the actual observed effect adjusted for what happened to the control group. And notice that's a difference in differences, and lo and behold, that's why it got the name. So there's lots of variations on this. You can do regressions, you can use additional predictors, you can do it in logs, and then you get ratio of ratios, and so on. It's a very simple model of the counterfactual, which is what you need in order to get this whole causal inference gone. And if you think about it, this is really just a special case of what I talked about earlier, where you're building the model. The counterfactual is the first and most important step in getting the causal effect. You can do this. I'm going to skip this slide because it's really just repeating what I said earlier. You don't have to do linearity or anything like that. This works for more complicated models. But that leads me into the kind of action item, machine learning, which I haven't mentioned up until now, really. They're in the business of building predictive models. That's what machine learning is all about. And usually they just try to do this raw prediction, but that's the first and most important and most necessary stage in building the model, the counterfactual. You build a predictive model that explains or describes the historical data, then you use that to extrapolate to a new population or into the future, and that's your estimate of the counterfactual. You apply treatment, you now get the difference between the observed and the counterfactual. Now you have a true causal estimate of the impact of the treatment that you're concerned with. So I think this is a very, very natural thing for machine learning to move to doing this kind of estimate of the counterfactual. And then you get true causal impacts, or ideally you get true causal impact out of the statistical methods. Lots of other topics in this area. This is really the most simple explanation I could come up with. There are structural models where you have lots of different causal paths, so it's not just this simple something affects X, something affects the error term. You could have more complicated causal structures. That comes up in economics, comes up in computer science. Judea Pearl has done a lot of work in this area. There are methods where you're looking at a problem, you're trying to model who is it that got treated? What are the characteristics of the people who chose the treatment? That uses a technique known as propensity scoring, and so on. So there's lots of rich material here that I would encourage you to look at, and I recommend these two books, Mastering Metrics and Mostly Harmless Econometrics. Very easy to read, lots of very rich and interesting examples, and you too can apply these causal techniques in your work in the future. So thank you. So it's good?
Yeah, it's good. Well, first, thank you so much for that. And the reason I wanted to invite, to have this session here is because for many of us in this room, this is the kind of biggest question that we're asking ourselves, which is to understand the effect of our work. And to do that, we need to understand counterfactuals. We need to know what would have happened if our organizations weren't to exist, or we weren't to offer the programs that we were. And you've raised a few issues. And I have a couple questions, and then I want to open up to the audience. So if you have questions, feel free to line up at the microphones, and we'll come to those in a minute. But one of the thoughts I had was, essentially, can we just add more variables to our models to get out of this hidden, the error problem, essentially? One of the things I've heard other people who come from more of the big data tradition say, like, just throw a bunch of data at it and the errors diminish and eventually get to zero over time. So do you see that as being possible with some of the world that we operate in, where it's not random assignment, it's not all of these kind of things. We're working in an environment where we're choosing where to offer services and people are choosing whether they want to go to them or not. Can we just collect more data and throw more variables at this thing and get rid of the error term?
So more variables might help, but they have to be the right variables. They have to be variables that really impact the choice of treatment, for example. If you look at these propensity score models, you're saying, well, why did this person get treated? Because they had these characteristics. Maybe they were a really high energy person who says, oh yes, I want to do this, want to do that. Well, that's going to affect other things that they do, and maybe you observe that or maybe you don't. So it's one of these cases where, yes, if your predictive model of who got treatment was a very good model and fit the data really well, you might be happy, but it's not going to solve the whole problem typically, especially when you're dealing with human choices, because there's so many things that impact those choices of X on the right-hand side that you're never going to be fully confident that you really have a completely accurate model. And by the way, of course, as you know, with machine learning, you can throw a lot of variables into the hopper, but they don't always stay there. So you don't necessarily want to use all the possible variables. In some cases, they're just adding noise, and it's not going to be a very helpful model.
It raises a really good point that propensity score matching is something that I've seen actually a lot of organizations use when doing this kind of work. And it's essentially saying, how likely is somebody to, equally likely to have been in your program and not be in your program? Let's compare those individuals over time. When I was at the YMCA, we actually did a lot of that to say, kids that choose to come to our programs are different than kids who choose not to come to our programs. And so just comparing the kids that we served versus the kids that we didn't serve is actually comparing the wrong things there. One of the other things I wanted to ask was for you to maybe expand a little bit more on the opportunities for machine learning. Mm-hmm. This is something, some of the work I was doing at the University of Chicago is around applying machine learning to estimate counterfactuals. Who are you seeing do that work right now, and how effective is that being used?
Well, they're definitely beginning to get interested, and the two techniques that are the most popular are doing this estimation of the counterfactual, shows up in a lot of places, but particularly there's regression discontinuity approach that I referred to. You have people who are just on one side or just on the other side of a threshold. And those cases are pretty easy to do using the existing technology. I saw a nice one. Somebody was trying to estimate the impact of Georgia Tech online master's degree in computer science. This is a fantastic program. The cost is 1/5 of the cost of the physical attendance program. And the issue was, well, maybe those people would have gone to get a master's degree anyway. We don't know. So they looked at the people that were just on one side of the test score boundary and just on the other side of the boundary, and they could estimate the true incremental effect of the program. And that's something that would show up, I think, in a lot of the cases that you're concerned about, for example. So you try to look for something that influenced the kids going to your program versus the other kids. I don't know what it would be. You have to have you have to have specific knowledge of the domain to come up with these things, but they're pretty powerful techniques.
Yeah, that actually raises a good point. How do you see the interaction between domain experts and methodological experts? People who understand the programs or the environments that they're being operated in versus those that have the strong statistical and quantitative training?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's been debated for some time. I've had this debate on several occasions, in fact. If you're just doing prediction, then the domain knowledge may not be so important. You want to have a lot of these tricks of the trade and experience allow you to build a good predictive model. But if you're trying to do this kind of thing, where you're looking for causal inference, you want to know what's plausible and what isn't, what are the kinds of factors that could be important for different levels of the treatment. And there, I think domain knowledge is really critical.
And that raises a really good point, which is depending upon the questions that we ask, we're going to want to use different methods. Sometimes you do just care about the actual prediction itself. And so oftentimes actually machine learning does quite a good job at predicting something. You might not understand why it arrived at that value, and it won't give you causal inference. But so it's really about understanding, expanding the toolkit and saying there's different types of methods that can be used to answer different types of questions.
So many years ago, we were doing some machine vision work at Berkeley, and our corpus that we were doing the machine vision work on was the California State Archives of photographs, that were all the photographs taken by the government of California. And we set our challenge to recognize Ronald Reagan, and it was completely trivial to do so because he always posed with a flag. So you just look for red, white, and blue with a little black, and there it was. So it was a case where the machine learning problem was getting exactly the right answer, but it was one of those confounding variables in there. Yeah. The choice of where to pose was what was important in that case.
Well, it shows the importance of the data that you're training on. I actually saw a funny example yesterday of a neural network that had been trained just on Sesame Street faces and then applied to like human faces, and it has some funny results. You should Google that. So the last question I want to have, and then I'll go to audience questions, is this. So when we were talking a week or two ago, you were saying that at Google, you guys run 10,000 experiments or more a year.
Yep.
Why has Google chosen to do that, make such a huge investment in experimentation, and what's the value that it's generating for the organization?
Well, the experiments, there are many different kinds. There's about 5,000 on the search side and 5,000 on the ad side. The 5,000 on the search side is, well, did our change make a difference? And if so, how big a difference? So we've got, hopefully, improvements in the algorithm, or things that we think are improvements in the search algorithm. And so we'll run experiments. We apply them on some randomly chosen set of the queries, and others where we don't apply them, and then we compare the various performance differences. So that's what anybody would do if you're trying to improve the product that you're offering. You want to know if you've really got an improvement. And lots of cases, those experiments don't work out. They may work out well in a controlled environment in a laboratory, but when you release them into the wild, they don't give you the boost that you were hoping for. And then on the ad side, well, advertising is all about causality. The old line, half of my advertising budget is wasted, I just don't know which half. And so the problem there is we want to know, well, did that spend, or did that bid, or did that text really make a difference in terms of people buying my product? And they want to know because they're spending real money to make that happen. So that's a situation where experiments are absolutely critical.
One of the things I think that sometimes happens in our organizations is that I think we over-focus on the big experiments, the big multi-million-dollar randomized control trials, and lose sight of all of the small experiments we can be doing all of the time. I think as a sector, we way under-invest in experimentation, because really, experimentation leads to insight. It leads to knowledge and understanding.
Absolutely.
And that's something I think we just have under-invested in.
Well, one thing you can do, they're just simple things where you, instead of rolling something out in one fell swoop, you roll it out over a period of weeks, and then you can look at what happens if I offer this mailing to one group of people, I wait a week, look at the responses, then I offer it to a different group of people, and I'm doing a kind of rolling model where I've always got the next group as a control for the group that's been treated this week. So they're just simple things that you could do where you get into this experimental culture and really try to answer these questions by doing rigorous experiments rather than something else. We have a saying in Silicon Valley: you can make choices based on data, or you can make choices based on hippos. And what's a hippo? The hippo is the highest paid person's opinion. So.
Yeah, we have that problem too. I think we have a question, except they're called board members here.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Exactly.
Yeah. I think we have a question over here.
So I'm curious how this compares to the chronic disease epidemiology technique, where people make causal inference all the time from big data using odds ratios, and then control for confounding variables using logistic regression. And it sounds similar, but I'd just be curious how it compares to that.
Yeah, so there, if you have a true clinical study, you can assign people to the treatment, you have placebos, you have this whole structure, and that's the gold standard. I mean, that's the best way to do things. You can't always do those experiments in social science considerations. We can't flip a coin about whether somebody gets into college or not, generally, assigning things random, but you can look for cases that are like random, and those might help you get some insight. So you're absolutely right. Clinical studies are the ideal way, but they aren't always practical for the kinds of questions we need to answer.
Actually, the case control studies are retrospective,
Yeah.
and they're natural. I mean, there's no controlling. It's like looking at people with lung cancer and seeing how many smoked and how many didn't smoke, and then controlling for the confounding variables. So it's not a pure, clinical trial kind of.
Well, that one is tricky because with smoking and non-smoking, people choose to smoke, and there can certainly be confounding variables there. And there was a long, long debate about this in the literature. So ideally, you would like to look at these studies and get some kind of random assignment or regression discontinuity or difference in differences. Some of these approaches have been used for these health studies.
The public health space is very much based upon some of the methodology being discussed here, but there are, again, I think it's about expanding the toolkit that's available to us for certain kind of questions. All right, we have a question over here.
The conference is to use research and data for social good. And I know there's foundations that are doing some good work in this regard. I hope there are some influencers in the public sector that are part of the proceedings here, because I see a lack, whether it be because of the fear of testing and a failure on the part of public agencies. How can we incentivize or engage the governments that should look more for the long term, but so often are looking at the short term and the fear of failure? Just a couple of examples that I've had in the last few years. In the beginning of the Obama administration came the housing crisis. They had billions of dollars for the neighborhood demonstration programs. First part was just block granted out. The second part was reserved for inventive programs. But when they got all these applications of what to do about blighted communities, deteriorated housing, land grants, and so forth, they instead massively shifted the money out to, lo and behold, Chicago, Los Angeles, Phoenix, and elsewhere. And the money obviously was such a small component, it really didn't affect housing prices at all. A few years later, talked to the White House on the-job training programs, and they were thinking of their major issue is people who have been unemployed 6 months or longer, but OJT was limited to just a few weeks, lots of constraints. They just didn't want to get into an experiment to see what would work that would productively have multi-year or long-term sustainable results. So how do we move beyond individuals doing this research and very favorable foundations sponsoring the research to actually implementing it in the US and around the globe for more sustainable, long-term, productive results?
Well, one thought, and this is just a thought at this point, is when the need exceeds the supply of available treatment, think about using a lottery, because a lottery you're going to learn the most from in terms of how effective that treatment is. So there are lots of studies out there, like Amy Finkelstein's study of Medicaid. There's studies of the impact of military service on subsequent jobs that use the draft lottery as the randomizing device. So it's not a bad idea if you really want to learn what the causal impacts look like. People will accept that as a way of assigning treatment, and it gives you the most bang for your buck in terms of learning.
I think, too, one of the challenges with public sector entities, and I was talking to somebody in New York City about this, and they're saying that the challenge sometimes with experimentation or even innovation in the public sphere is that there's a huge downside, a huge cost for denying somebody treatment that deserves it, right? So for saying, oh, our models, said that you didn't need food stamps, but you actually do, right? Or whatever it might be. And because there's such a huge cost to that, and really from, if you think of a bureaucrat perspective, no benefit necessarily to doing the job that much better, you're going to, avoid incurring that cost through experimentation and innovation. And so the public sector side is hard, and I think we do need ways of, we need to find ways of leveraging the experiments that we can run to push for policies that are evidence-based, to push for policies that do work. But I think some of that's going to have to come from the outside in. I don't think it's going to bubble up necessarily from the public sector itself. Yeah, another question over here?
Yeah, I wanted to revisit the question of domain expertise versus methodological expertise. So, in my experience, a lot of times it ends up being only one or the other is available, which is really unfortunate. But then when they are available and can work together, which is also, collaboration is challenging, oftentimes I think it works really well in the case where, they're working together and designing an experiment around what data they're going to start collecting. But we're moving into a world where the data is already collected a lot of the times through other channels. And I think it's particularly challenging in the context of mission-driven nonprofit work, where you have both expertise together to try to come up with interesting questions to ask that are relevant to the data that's available. Are there any techniques other than pure brainstorming processes that are actually available, methodological techniques that can help identify how the data could be, what interesting questions the data can be used to answer that could facilitate the process of better utilizing the data that's available for certain domains. I mean, it's a very abstract question, but it is what people are dealing with in a lot of ways.
Well, I will say I'm going to come back to the data versus hippo issue because that's critical in both the public sector and private sector. One of the great things at Google is our management was so enlightened that they recognized when a debate could be resolved by an experiment and when the debate really required some guessing or knowledge or experience on the point of view of the decision makers. So if you get in this mindset, here's a problem. Well, is there an experiment I could run? Or is there some data that exists that might be able to resolve this question? And if you get in the habit of doing that, then you'll find lots of opportunities to make these kind of small experiments you were talking about that could help improve your processes. So it's really a point is you just have to start thinking in that way in order to make progress.
I think this point of mindset's really important. I think when organizations sometimes, I'm talking with them and they're asking what investments can they make to promote the use of data in their organizations. I always say cultural investments are always better than technological ones, for the most part. Like creating a culture that thinks in this kind of way, that thinks in terms of evidence, that thinks about how to experiment in small ways, is a much better return on investment most of the time than going out and buying a big technology product or something like that. Like infusing this kind of way of thinking in our organizations is vital. A question over here?
So I want to thank you for really showing your work and providing us with a lot of references for the methodologies that you've shared with us today. And my question is, do you think some of the best methodologies, including some of the algorithms that are being generated, some of the machine learning techniques that are being used today, are publicly available for people working in the public sector? Are the best practices really out there and available to us? And if not, how can those of us who work in a sector that can't offer the most money really incentivize sharing and opening up some of these newer, more complex econometric and machine learning tools?
Well, the short answer is yes. There's wonderful open source software out there of R and Python, and there's lots and lots of great data that's become available. A lot of companies, including Google, have released data for image recognition. For example, we just released 9.6 million labeled images. So you could use this for training your image recognition models. We've released a bunch of labeled YouTube, so you can look at animation and try to match the labels that are assigned there. So there's a huge amount of free resources available on the methodological side. The challenge is just keeping up with it all. I mean, that's what's hard because there's so many new developments happening. And one of the things that you should definitely do with your researchers is make sure that they have time to do some career development and some learning because of all these exciting things happening in the area. If you don't really devote the time to improving your knowledge base, you're going to fall behind.
And it's absolutely right. There are tons of open source resources. I mean, Google even released TensorFlow.
Yes.
Some of the neural network stuff as open source. But what I found is that to use some of these open source tools requires a pretty good amount of human capital. There's not going to be an off-the-shelf great machine learning product all the time. And this is where I think we need to begin addressing some of the human capital challenges that our sector faces and giving people the opportunity to be mentored and gain professional development experience. One of the things I've done at Uptake is we started a data fellows program to do this, to pair data analysts from nonprofits with our data scientists and machine learning experts to mentor them. Because I do think some of these skills, too, are really right for a mentorship kind of learning experience. So there are definitely a ton of open source tools, but it does require a level of human capital to use them.
And in fact, there are great tools online for learning, tutorials, examples, YouTube videos. I found out a few days ago that there are 500 million YouTube views of instructional material that go on per day. So there's a huge amount, and this isn't just the high-level stuff, even various kinds of handyman or cooking or all sorts of other skills are available free online for people to access. And you just have to, again, get in the mind flow of saying, well, I'm going to devote half a day a week to reviewing these materials of what's going on in my field, what other people are doing, what works, what doesn't.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question over here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Michael Keogh from Johigo, and my question is for Hal, and it's an organizational one. How do you prioritize your testing of potentially confounding variables? Kind of organizationally, maybe not like mathematically, but if you have 50 things that might be potentially confounding, how do you sort of prioritize them, given your finite time, resources, et cetera, to go for the most likely one you want to understand and then sort of beyond that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think the first point is we try to do experimentation as a matter of course. Whenever we make a change, we want to roll it out a little bit, see how it goes, and we'll roll it out a little bit more, we'll get more information, and so on. So that whole idea of gradualism and comparing what's happening to those exposed to this new tweak versus those who aren't, that's absolutely critical to what we do. And I will say this is very hard to do for government, because why are they getting this and we're not? I believe that if you could establish a general principle that we're going to do this kind of phased rollout, that would be very, very helpful in understanding how effective the programs are and improve the design early rather than late. So that's one thing I think the public sector could really learn from the private sector, try to overcome those political objections to gradual rollouts.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing this with us.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. It was fun. Whoops.
So a couple of quick announcements. If you haven't already, be sure to download the conference app. It's a great way to stay in touch. And on top of all of the other announcements that we'll be pushing out to you throughout the day. We're going to have a break now until 11:30. Breakouts are going to be kind of throughout the building. There's going to be people helping direct you to those. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. But thank you so much for being here, for kicking off the conference in such a great way, and enjoy the rest of your day.